Carbon sequestration is one of the many reasons we look at regenerative farming practices. Yes, we want better yields, healthier, more nutritionally dense crops, and a more sustainable way to produce food, sure. But we also get to improve the storing and dispersion of carbon in the air and beneath the soil. Carbon is the basis of all life and needed for natural cycles, so carbon cycling is extremely important in the context of climate change or just planet health. It is a natural process, after all. As biological matter decomposes, it releases methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. But nature takes care of itself. The ocean, forests, and grasslands all play some part in absorbing it all. By tackling the carbon head-on and bringing it to your land, your crops will be healthier for it, and the air you breathe will be too. A study on regenerative practices conducted just last year came up with some pretty staggering results. For all the Teslas and recycling that we're trying to employ, it's the regenerative farms that are making the biggest difference of all. Here are the 7 ways that they discovered that we're changing the world, and also the ways that you should be utilizing, both for the future and for the benefit of your land. Let's start with the first of the 7, agroforestry. Agroforestry is the practice of planting various crops together, especially by combining the production of trees with low-growing vegetables in between the rows. Any plant is going to absorb carbon, but none more so than trees. So it shouldn't be surprising that this system of both the high and the low growth being better for carbon absorption. But the system actually has a lot of benefits for your crops. The canopy of the trees are going to protect your vegetables from birds and insects. Their root systems allow for a bowl effect to take place underground, holding onto nutrients and water much more efficiently, exactly the way raised beds would, just underground. Crops just do better when there's more diversity. But we often forget that diversity can also mean planting trees and grains too. We always just focus on the veg and the herbs. You can decrease carbon emissions by up to 35% more than conventional farming. The second phase of study centered around cover cropping. Up to 12% of carbon was sequestered back into the soil when cover crops were introduced between plantings. This is an enormous advantage. Growing foliage, no matter what kind of plant it is, does better with more carbon to work with. It is the building block of plant growth. Without it, they cannot photosynthesize, and it forms the basis of their energy storages. We need carbon in the soil. Without it, plants cannot grow. Cover crops have tons of additional benefits, such as controlling erosion, balancing soil nutrients, etc. By killing off the microbiomes in the earth with our pesticides, there are no bugs left to break down the compost into simple carbon for the plants to work with. Bringing us to the third phase of study. In the third phase of study, they combined the use of agroforestry and cover cropping by using legumes specifically. Legumes were the best crop of all when the data came out. Legumes, of all its variants, not only improved carbon amounts in the air, they also added more nutrients back into the soil than the other low-growing varieties. Beets weren't far behind, just barely missing out on the top spot. By planting them in between the rows of orchards, they were able to bring up those numbers by another 8 to 15%. Finally, managing to match agroforestry with only one crop at a time, meaning that you don't necessarily have to grow dozens of different varieties at a time to be successful. Fourth on the docket was reducing the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. It's having 2 sides to the argument. The first and most obvious one is to preserve the microbial life that's keeping the biomes, or carbon, in perpetual balance. If they aren't there to break everything down, then there's no carbon being produced for the soil that needs it. But the second aspect of this is often overlooked. All of the chemical aids that we use are themselves greenhouse gases. Just using 1 ton of sulfuryl fluoride on your field is the equivalent of 5,000 tons of pure CO2. Just the production phase of these pesticides is producing even more CO2 than they are in the fields that they're being sprayed in. A good 40% of what you're spraying on your corn isn't even staying on the plant or growing into the ground. It's going straight up in the air. There are organic options, or at least products that aren't as harsh to the atmosphere or the ground as approved pesticides are. But they aren't nearly as heavily funded or advertised as the safer options. And the joke here is that the organic ones like pyrethrin, neem oil, rotenone, and sabadilla are much more effective than the poison culprits are, but their use is almost never encouraged openly. Fifth was the use of no chemical fertilizer. Starting at the production line, making fertilizer causes 5% of global CO2 emissions, most of which are released at the factory long before it reaches the field. Anything that decomposes is going to release CO2. The difference is where it's decomposing. Breaking down naturally in the soil cut this release in half, putting the carbon back where it belongs, in the ground where your crops can make use of it. But in the factory, 3/4 of these emissions go into the air directly. Cut this down by dumping that manure in the field where it should have been in the first place, feeding the critters underground and feeding the crops that are going into the field. Speaking of manure, our favorite, let's look at integrating animals into the field. Animal manure is the primary source of greenhouse emissions, but that's just because we've been farming singular animals at a time. Very rarely do you see farming done on a large scale that adds diversity to their fields anymore. You rear cattle and nothing else. Or you're a chicken farmer. No other livestock, no crops, just chickens. We're concentrating all of that manure so much that it's releasing more nitrous oxide than it needs to. By running animals through your fields in between sowing and after the harvest, it's not that you're producing less manure, it's how it's being dispersed that matters. The animal tramples their own droppings into the ground, driving it down where it needs to be. Like studies suggested, getting that manure in the field from the get-go is going to go a long way to getting as much carbon into the ground as possible. Under the surface, it decomposes, releasing the carbon downward and fertilizing your field for the next crop to go down. By allowing any kind of livestock or fowl to work in a field, you're building topsoil organically, getting more microorganisms, and you're cutting emissions by half. Integrating livestock with crop agriculture leads to less CO2, more natural fertilizer, and more beneficial insects, better soil, and generally a big decrease in your expenses. Also, the more diverse your produce is, both from animals and crops, the more security you have on the market. The loss of one product doesn't need to be a complete disaster. Putting all your eggs in one basket is never a good idea, especially in a profession that is as unpredictable as farming. And now that we're on the subject of tilling manure into the ground by using your livestock, there's more reason to opt for a no-till method than using a tractor. Every study out there suggests that tilling with machinery is a bad idea in every way. Plowing everything in sight is one of the main causes for the Great American Dust Bowl that caused thousands to die of starvation in the early 1900s. Tilling's terrible for a lot of things. It kills off biodiversity, leading to farmers buying factory-made fertilizers because no amount of compost can decompose to feed the crops as they grow. It leads to erosion, absolutely destroys topsoil, and most of all, it releases gases that should be underground. Not relying on tilling by conventional means reduces emissions by 55%, and that's on the low end of estimates. And it doesn't really matter how you approach tilling, as long as you're not going as deep as the tractors go. Whether you use a broad fork or a herd of cattle, you'll be reducing the amount of gases that are released by at least half of what the big operations are. At the end of the day, carbon, nitrous oxide, and methane are terrible for the atmosphere, but it's great for the soil, and we need to do everything we can to keep it in proper use. Monoculture farming is bad for the environment, and it's high risk. The more crops and animals you can integrate on a patch of land, the more diverse your market value will be. It's better for your pocket, more sustainable in the long term, and it's better for the atmosphere and the environment. Get some life on your field, as much of it as you can, and utilize them both on the field and on the sales floor. It doesn't matter if it's green or if it oinks and clucks. Life is life, and the more there is of it, the more carbon is being driven into the earth. And from there, it just goes back to feeding the new cycle of living things that come around, creating the perfect circular ecosystem, just as it should be. Regenerative farming is so much more than just being sustainable. It can literally reverse global warming for half the cost and more produce. Why on earth are we still so hell-bent on industrializing a system that doesn't need it? It's less productive at the end of the day and has so much negative output that it can't possibly keep going the way it is without driving us all into a food crisis. Stop this downward spiral by employing better agricultural practices on your land now. Or have you already been doing it? For those of you who have, and those of you who are thinking about making the change, tell us about your plans in the comments below. You know how much we enjoy hearing from our viewers. There's no way to bring about change without regenerative pioneers. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and love the land, because it'll love you back tenfold. Cheers!